most of us, if we're honest, live like functional atheists. And what I mean by that is we go about our day-to-day lives without reference to God, almost by instinct. It's this feeling that the world is this closed system that's detached from anything beyond the physical world. And that stands in contrast to the worldview we find in the book of Ruth. In Ruth, the three main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, all speak in ways that acknowledge God's hand in all things, despite the fact that he never speaks nor performs a single miracle throughout the entire narrative. And that tells us something about the way that God works in the world. Does he do miracles? Of course he does. Does he do extraordinary things? The Bible's full of those moments. But often he works through ordinary, normal means. And so Ruth challenges this notion that the ways that God works must be always immediately perceptible or extravagant, when in fact, the story of God's faithfulness in the book of Ruth begins in the lives of two grieving widows searching for bread. This is Understanding Ruth. The book of Ruth centers around one major theme, hesed, which is the Hebrew word for faithfulness. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz all serve as exemplars of hesed, which mirrors the hesed, the faithfulness of God. And this faithfulness is a free act in which someone goes above and beyond their natural obligations to show mercy and generosity to someone else. Think about God's faithfulness. He owes us nothing, and yet he goes above and beyond his natural obligation to show us mercy and generosity and to be our God. He chooses to be our faithful God. He pledges himself by promises that are not demanded of him, but rather an act of his own free choice to be generous to sinners. That he is our God and we are his people is something that God does by grace. And so God's faithfulness manifests in a series of reversals that we see in this narrative. Naomi begins emptied. She's emptied of her husband and her sons and any hope of a future. But her story ends in fullness when, through Ruth, she receives descendants that continue her family line. Think about Ruth, the reversals in her life. She's a Moabite, a foreigner, somebody descended from peoples that are at enmity with Israel. And yet she ends the story as a daughter of Israel, engrafted into the genealogy of David and ultimately the lineage of Christ. All of this testifies to the God who brings life out of death and joy out of sorrow, who fills those who are empty. And so Ruth 1 lays that out for us, and it divides into three sections. First, we are introduced to Naomi as a widow. There's the widowing of Naomi in the foreign land of Moab in verses 1 to 6. Second, there's the journey of Naomi and her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to Judah. That's verses 7 to 18. And then the return of Naomi and Ruth to Bethlehem in the final portion in verses 19 to 22. Let's look at that first initial inciting event in verses 1 to 6. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So the narrative begins. We have our inciting incident. A famine hits Bethlehem, forcing Naomi's family to find food in the country of Moab. Tragedy strikes when Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, leaving her with 2 sons and their Moabite wives Orpah and Ruth. Yet despite these afflictions, the author of Ruth skillfully embeds seeds of hope in this opening narrative. There's this detail about Naomi's family tracing their lineage to the Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, which is the exact ancestry of King David, hinting at the role that this family is going to play in God's redemptive purposes. God also reverses the fortunes of Bethlehem. There's an irony in the beginning, because Bethlehem is the house of bread. That's what the name means. And yet the house of bread is experiencing famine, emptiness, and lack. But the end of this opening portion in verse 6, Naomi hears that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So God has once again filled the house of bread with a harvest. And this opens the door for Naomi to return to her homeland. Now we zoom in a little more and we focus on some details as the narrative shifts to the dialogue between Naomi and Ruth. Let's look at verses 7 to 18. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. The first spoken words of each character provides valuable insight into their desires, their longings, and their affections. Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah to depart and return home, hoping that God blesses them with new husbands. And Orpah accepts. Why forfeit her future for the sake of this barren old woman? And Naomi gets it. She has nothing to offer them, and she doesn't want them to sacrifice their future for her. And her decision makes sense in a way, because she bears no obligation to remain with Naomi. And yet Ruth goes above and beyond her obligations and sacrifices her homeland, her religion, and her future to pledge faithfulness, hesed, to Naomi. And Ruth's first words manifest this faithfulness, this righteous character, which becomes a major theme throughout the book. She says to her, "I'm pledging my life to you. Your God will be my God. I am not going to depart. I'm not going to leave you." So her first words show her righteous character, and Naomi's first words display both her sorrow and her love. She's grieved. She doesn't want them to give up their future for her. She's thinking about their well-being. And yet there's also this raw pain in her heart that she feels empty, that the Lord has brought her into a place of deep affliction. And as a woman in the ancient Near East with no husband or sons, she is very vulnerable. And she is losing any earthly hope of securing her dead husband's lineage. It's a very painful thing to experience. And this again highlights the generosity, the compassion, the love of Ruth. That she's willing to sacrifice so much for somebody who really is not going to give anything to her. And again, you can see how that reflects the hesed of God, the faithfulness of God, who marks out Israel as his people, despite them not being able to provide him with anything. And this Moabite woman demonstrates a faithfulness to God that puts to shame the Israelites in the times of the judges. She is more of a daughter of Abraham than any of the judges. In a world where, as Judges says, every man does as he pleases, every man does what is right in his sight, Ruth wants to obey God. And we see some traces of hope in this next little section, verses 19 to 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, and when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. This final section merges the destinies of Naomi and Ruth in a profound way as they enter into Bethlehem. The author speaks of Ruth the Moabite, emphasizing her foreignness, as returning to Bethlehem from the country of Moab. Notice there's an adoption going on here. That now she is returning back to her home because she has placed herself within the family of Naomi. She has pledged herself to be one of God's people. And this signals the key role that Ruth plays in the redemption arc of Naomi's story, as their destinies are intertwined. Naomi means pleasant, but she experiences her return to Bethlehem as anything but pleasant. Imagine the whole town that's stirred up and saying, "Is this Naomi? Is this pleasant?" And you can understand Naomi's sharp response, "Don't call me that. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. Because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Describes the anguish of her situation. Now, you can sit here and say, well, is she being irreverent? It can be a little harsh and judgmental on Naomi, but anyone who's experienced grief can resonate with these words. And notice that she never chalks up her afflictions to fate or chance, but God. She's actually revealing her faith. She's saying, no, I know that God is in control. That's exactly why I'm saying that it's his hand that is against me. And I don't think she's saying that God hates her or that God isn't good, but she's expressing phenomenologically her experience from the ground up. And we see this in the Psalms, where they express God turning his face and being against him and having his hand against him as a way of describing this anguish when we, under the sovereign hand of God, experience various trials. It's actually not a denial of God, but it's actually an affirmation of his absolute sovereignty over all things. In the valley and in the green fields, God is still God, and he will be faithful in all those things. But it's also very human. I mean, Naomi has experienced the worst grief of her life, and I'm sure in our moments of grief, we're going to say things that aren't theologically, politically correct, and yet they are the honest cry of our hearts. It's not flippant towards God. It's not denying him, but it is this raw complaint, this raw lament of what's really going on in our hearts as we experience the various trials that God pulls us through. Like Job, she lays out her experience. She is patient, and yet that patience doesn't look like perfect Sunday school stoicism or anything like that. No, there's a grief, there's an anguish. This is hard. And she takes God seriously, which is why she is so honest. One commentator speaks about the freedom of her faith and the fact that she believes that God is so sovereign that she's going to actually attribute all things to him and describe all things in relation to him. And there's this awareness of God in every circumstance of her life. So let's not judge this woman too harshly. And let's actually see that this is a woman who's very aware that God is the source of all things. And she says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. The valley of Naomi's sorrow then becomes the stage upon which God manifests his faithfulness. Because Naomi doesn't return empty, but rather she carries the seeds of fullness and redemption in Ruth. She returns with the very person that God is going to use to bring about his good and glorious purposes. God remains firmly in the driver's seat of Naomi's story. Yes, the Lord emptied Ruth, but only in order that he might fill her again with more than she could ask or think. Maybe that's your situation. You feel emptied by various trials, and you are considering the prospect of changing your name to bitter. But remember God's faithfulness, his hesed. He will fill your emptiness. And we know this in a greater way because of Christ. Christ is the one who is God in the flesh, who comes and leaves his homeland to enter ours as the Son of David. He's born in the house of bread in Bethlehem that he might give his life as heavenly bread for the hungry. That he chooses to remain with us despite no obligation toward us. He sets his love upon us to be our Savior and our Redeemer. And in Christ we find the embodiment of that divine faithfulness. For all the promises of God find their yes in him. And that's where the story is heading. All the sorrows, all the twists and turns are preparation for God's deliverance.